connected, really. And just to say that it is being recorded, so so I hope everyone is okay with that. But the Ideas Lab then has been a kind of a virtual space of debate, work in progress, collaboration, conversation, and so on. And we'll be running it. Typically, it's an hour session, but what's been fabulous about the space, and I can see some of our colleagues, Iran, for example, is in China, is people came in from all over the world, because when the pandemic hit, many of our students here in Cambridge were all told in a very kind of, I'm not happy about it. I was not happy about it, but just to leave, and to leave quickly and to go home. And so the whole question of how do we build a community together that actually enabled us to continue our work together and our conversations and so on. And so today it's just such a great pleasure to welcome colleagues in from Brazil. It's early in the morning for you there. So Andrea, Mario and Katerina, welcome to the Ideas Lab. This is a special event and a special set of weeks, actually, where there's celebrations here going on, connecting with colleagues from all over the world around 100 years of the work of Paulo Freire, an incredibly significant figure in the education world, and in my mind, a figure right at the moment whose pedagogy, it seems to me, is so important and so timely. And yet, as our colleagues from Brazil will actually begin to explore today, Paulo Freire's contributions and person to some extent, what he's stood for, is actually being vilified by the far right, and many of us shouldn't be surprised at one level by that, because it would strike me anyway, if we look at what's going on here in the UK, the far right, or if we look at the United States, the far right's become incredibly strident and public and very open about their attempts to defame, reframe, and so on. So without further ado, I actually want to perhaps quickly pass it over to my colleagues to say something a little bit more about the events over the 2 weeks, and then the format for today. So who, Alex or Hira or Rocio, who wants to do that part?
Please, Hira or Rocio.
So I'm just gonna give some ideas on how we are gonna run this event. So like Susan said, and this is part of a series of events about Paulo Freire that we are hosting here in the faculty in different formats, like reading group sessions, student conference, seminars, and keynotes. Our event today, part of the Ideas Lab, is going to be in English, and it's going to be recorded, like you can see now. And we are going to have a presentation by our colleagues, Mario, Catarina, and Andrea from Brazil. They're going to share some slides and talk through some of their work around what Susan just mentioned, the relationship between the far right and Paulo Freire. And then we are going to have some Q&A as well at the end. So if you want to put some questions on the chat as we go through the presentation, towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to collect some of those questions and then ask to our amazing presenters, and then put that to a discussion. So any questions you might have, just pop them on the chat, and we are going to grade them and ask the presenters towards the end.
So Hira, I'm going to give over the chairing to you, because just colleagues on this call, I have to dive out and do something, then I'm coming back. So I'm going to miss a bit of the presentation. I apologize for that, but it's not in my control. But I'm just so grateful to have everyone here, and our colleagues from Brazil. I've had a long time association with Brazil, and at one point I had a 5-year business visa to go to Brazil. I'd gone there, but my Portuguese is never good enough when I go down there. So I apologize for not getting that part of the credential in place. So over to you, Alex, Hira, and Rocio.
Thank you very much, Susan. And it's a pleasure for us to receive Mario, Andrea, and Catarina from Brazil contributing to the presentation today. The idea of the presentation, as you saw on the advertising, is that they are going to talk to us a little bit about the work they've been doing about Paulo Freire and the relationship with the Brazilian far-right and the reception of Paulo Freire's ideas by the Brazilian far-right. They have published an article at BIRA, one of the BIRA journals here in the UK about that. I'm going to put a link in the chat for anyone who might be interested in taking a look at that article. And then we are going to do some Q&A at the end. Our members of CLAREC, the organizing group behind all of this, they are going to be putting some things on the chat also about the other events related to our celebration of Paulo Freire anniversary. So please keep an eye on the chat here as well for things they're going to be advertising. It's going to be, we still have a lot of events happening tomorrow and then next week as well. So for you to keep an eye on other things related to the series of events that are still happening in the faculty. Without further ado, I might open the floor to Mario, Catarina, and Andrea, and welcome you to our Ideas Lab and to our celebration of the centenary of Paulo Freire's birth. A pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for your contributions to our events. I'll let you introduce yourselves because you come from a very interesting, you work in a very interdisciplinary group, so it's going to be great to hear what your work have been, what kind of work you've been doing in this area, and what kinds of research you've been developing in this topic. So thank you so much for your contribution today.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. So first of all, I'm just going to do a quick introduction of myself. My name is Mario Alves. I am professor on civil society and nonprofit management at Fundação Getúlio Vargas School of Business Administration of São Paulo. So where I am also part of, I am the Associate Dean for the Public Administration and Government graduate program there. And I am also part of the board of the International Society for Third Sector Research. So where I've been doing research on civil society for the last 25 years. So that's why I'm here. So I'm looking for my colleagues to introduce themselves. Catarina and Andrea.
Okay, hi, I'm Catarina. I am a researcher at the Center for Metropolitan Studies and also professor at the Federal University of ABC, Universidade Federal do ABC. And we have been developing this study since, I think, 2018. And so I think we have lots of things to share, and it's great to be here and be able to discuss that with you.
Good morning to us here in Brazil, and good afternoon to people from other countries. My name is Andrea Martini Pineda. I am a PhD student in Fundação Getúlio Vargas too. Mario Aquino is my advisor. And I am a researcher at a Center of Studies of Public Administration in Fundação Getúlio Vargas too. I am interested in researches about diversity, the value of the diversity in education. So why I'm here in this research. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, so thank you. Sorry again, I'm just a little bit confused here by, I just realized that I was with the other version of the presentation, sorry. So here is the structure of how we are going to deal with this. So we are becoming, Andrea is going to address first the opening part, where she's going to talk a little bit about Paulo Freire's political timeline and the Brazilian context. So to talk a little bit about this. And then we are going to enter into the issue of the democratization and institutional changes, especially in the 80s and the 90s here in Brazil, which created the framework where some education policies were settled. And then we are going to enter into the Brazilian far right. And we are going also to explore the mechanisms far-right politics are using in order to create their coalition and how to put their ideas to move. And then at the end, Catarina, we will talk a little bit about the effects of this far-right coalition on education policy. So this is what we are going to do. So I'm just going to.
So thank you, Mario, and thank you, Hara, to share our article. It could be good. So I will start doing some context about the Paulo Freire's political time life that I don't know if somebody don't know the Paulo Freire's work could be good. So in 1960, Paulo Freire presents his thesis called Educação e Atualidade Brasileira in a competition for a share of history and philosophy of education at the College de Belas Artes de Pernambuco in Recife. Recife is the capital of Pernambuco in a southwest of Brazil, and the Paulo Freire's hometown. So in this period, in the 1960s, it was a very important moment to Paulo Freire's work because it's the moment when he emerges as the reference of popular education. So two years after, in 1962, Paulo Freire did a very famous experience in a very small city in Brazil, in the northeast too, but not in the Pernambuco, in another state, in Rio Grande do Norte, in a small city called Angicos. And in this city, these literacy rural workers in only 40 hours. He can literacy for 300, more than 300 illiteracy people can learn to read and write, and more important, thinking critically. So the job of the work of Paulo Freire is so important for these two keys, the thinking critically and the literacy work. But consequently of this good job, this important job, in January of 1964, he was invited by the President João Goulart, our president in that moment, to coordinate the recently created the National Literacy Plan. But unfortunately, it spends only few months, because in April 1st, Brazil suffers a coup, a military coup, that obviously had many restrictions in different areas, in social area, in cultural area, so in educational area too. And they eliminated completely the recently created national plan national literacy plan. A few months ago, in June 60, Paulo Freire Paulo Freire went in a prison, accused by international subversive and enemy of the Brazilian people and enemy of the God. So he spent more than 17 days in a prison, and after this he went to his exile. Many Brazilians, intellectuals and other educators and Brazilian thinkers in that period went to the exile too. And Paulo Freire spent 16 years in this exile. But it was a very productive period, productive work period, because he stayed in many countries. He started to Bolivia and Chile near Brazil, and after he went in many countries like United States, New Zealand, And he did a very important work in Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa too. So in 1979, Brazil created the law of amnesty, the amnesty law, and this law opened space to Paulo Freire and others educators return to Brazil. So Paulo Freire returned in 1980, and 5 years ago, the dictatorship ended. And it started, Mario will talk more about, but it started a very productive, very relevant period to Brazilian history, because it's the moment that the civil society started to articulate, to do movements to the re-democratization. And in 1988, we created our federal constitution that continues until today. Another important point in Paulo Freire's political timeline is that during 1989 until 1991, he was a Secretary of Education in the city of São Paulo, where he lives. That it's a local government, but São Paulo is the biggest city in Brazil, one of the biggest in the world. So it was a very relevant work that he did here. And he was in a left-wing government in the same party of the Lula da Silva, Dilma Rousseff, that was the Labour's Party, PT. Please, Mario. So, as we say in the beginning, we are not pedagogic. We are from the public administration course, public administration studies. So we try talking about from this place. To public administration studies, we elected some important points to Paulo Freire's pedagogy. One of the firstly is the dialogue between educators and studies. And we need to always remember that his first important job, this one in the Rio Grande do Norte, in Angicos, with rural workers, he needed to create a way to talk, to stay together with this context, with this rural workers context. So he teaching and learning process consider the context, training and experience of the students. In his teaching, he used examples and cases based on the students' concepts, lead them to think creatively. So he used the words of the day, the work, the life of that rural workers, and they can learn to read and to write and think creatively. So Paulo Freire's advocate defends all his life that reading and learning are necessarily conditions to guarantee the citizenship and the reality. And it's a very important point to understand our research, the position of the far right groups. Please, Mario. Remember the context of the dictatorship moment. So Paulo Freire was an educator, was a person who organization people of critical thinking, but also of literacy in a context with voting was prohibited for illiterate people. So some educator who organized people, put people together and talk about thinking critically, most probably will be a danger in any context, for any government. In a dictatorship, he was especially a great danger. So we consider that Paulo Freire's project is seen with two layers of subversion. And in a deeper layer, that's putting people coming aware, understanding instrumental question, and the literacy itself and what it means in a context of giving right to vote. In its sense, it becomes a problem to a national military project. So obviously, the national military project will not, the rural workers or the poor people be critically understand, can read, can stay literate. Please, Mario. So about Paulo Freire's idea, he defends, it's a very central idea in your work, is that the ideology as a crucial component of the process. Paulo Freire defends that there really is not neutral, and it is another important point to conflict with the right far, like Catarina and Mario will talk after. Although his ideas were very influential, they did not create the necessary impetus to become a landmark in Brazil educational policies. So it's very common. Paulo Freire it's a big reference, is very studied about in more than other countries than in Brazil. And another important point is that even being a Christian, exactly for advocating for a critical and a liberating pedagogy, he had religious and conservative moments to fear and not legitimated his ideas. He says this, he in a book about his life, he says that he went to prison because he was considered an enemy of God. They constructed this idea, they constructed this discourse to the enemy to Brazilian people and the God, even by being a Christian. Por favor, Mário. Seu microfone está fechado, Mário.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. And I'm taking the presentation now. From now, I'm going to start talking about this moment of civil society and democratization in the 80s and the 90s, which is very important to understand what's going on now in terms of this emergence of this far right here. So just in order to understand what the middle 80s and then the beginning of the 90s brought to Brazil. At the time of the military dictatorship, we were facing a combination of hyperinflation, and also unemployment and growth stagnation. So, and this is one of the causes of the fall of the military regime here. But it's not only this. It was also the movements of civil society. Most of civil society organized, especially grassroots movements that were organized through this combination of liberation theology and Freirian works. So a lot of NGOs working in the field, working with people, trying to organize themselves. So we have these kind of things. but after the formal democratization in 1985, we had a new constituency, a new constitution, and we had and from the constitution and other aspects, we have created a new democratic framework, which was very interesting in terms of, well, the first thing is the extension to the right to vote to illiterates and indigenous people, so which was were not granted in the past, so they were franchised to vote, so they were able to vote. So this is one thing. The second thing that is also important in terms of popular movements is the recognition of territorial rights of indigenous peoples and quilombolas, so the communities of former enslaved people that run away from their conditions and try to establish resistance communities there. So this is one thing. Another thing that was important is that health and education became universal. And this is important because granting them as universal rights was important in terms of designing public policies, universal public policies that were very important, that are very important here. Also, the other major thing is the consecration in our constitution of the participation in public policies of people and their representatives directly participating in public policies. So the creation of different councils, different committees, and also local experiences like the participatory budget, which started in Porto Alegre and then became international, and it became an international benchmark, which was good. And also the enlarging civil society space. So we were in this path in terms of creating a democratical space here, and from the 90s. So this was there. In terms of the education, we had the expansion of basic education, which was very important. So we had we enlarged the participation towards almost 90% of the population in the basic education system. So it was very important. And here is one issue that is very interesting in terms of what we are going to see how it was, because it is very instrumental to create Paulo Freire as a scapegoat for the far right, which is the implementation of the continued learning progression, which is very interesting because it's not a project, it wasn't a project, Paulo Freire's project in the beginning, because a lot of other educators, even in the beginning of the 20th century, tried to implement, and even some less conservative governments tried to implement. And it was in 1991, during Paulo Freire's term as Secretary of Education at the municipality of São Paulo, that continued learning progression system was really implemented as a public policy. So it was the first one who has done it. And in 1996, the Lei de Diretrizes e Bases da Educação, which is the national law that settles the basics of and regulates the basics of education, and also giving the different jurisdictions in our federation to what has been doing there. Also proclaimed the continued learning progression as one of the main policies that could be implemented by the states. And it, from the beginning, it raised criticism, and not only from, and it's very interesting because it raised criticism, especially among educators, because we know we can't take into account that educators are a single block. So we have also conservative educators, we have other people there. But it raised criticism because they said, well, the idea of not failing the progression of a student disempower us in order to create discipline, in order to create forms of educating children. So this was a very controversial, has been a very controversial issue here. And it's very interesting because it's going to be used lately by conservative and far-right critics of Paulo Freire in order to demonize him. Another thing that was important in terms of the democratization in education policies was the inclusive, creating the principle of inclusive education. So inclusive education which means that, well, we are not talking about a universal right. If we are talking about an universal right to education, we need to think of an inclusive school. And an inclusive school means all the broad spectrum of inclusiveness, not only to the PCD, but also to other forms of inclusion. So, which was very important in terms of especially during the beginning of this century with the Workers' Party government here, with the creation of the SECAD, and how SECAD which was the secretariat under the Ministry of Education, that was also focusing inclusive education, and also bringing policies to recognize, for example, black people's rights, black people's history, and also recognizing Afro-religious, African heritage religions as well. And then it comes the far right here. So how Paulo Freire has become one of the major targets of this Brazilian far right here. So we need to also to understand how they frame them. So how he framed him. So first, Paulo Freire and his pedagogy. So the far right starts to proclaim Paulo Freire as an ideologue of Marxist indoctrination in schools. So he is, forget about John Dewey, forget about other pragmatic influences on Paulo Freire. Well, he's only a Marxist. He's only there to demonize people and there. So this is very important, this. But also, as putting Paulo Freire at the center of the target, it spread also to educators. So educators were also seen as partisan and enemies of the family. Why? Because they are bringing, for example, and they are teaching gender ideology to the children. So what they call gender ideology, and this construct of gender ideology, which creates threats to the Christian families and their values. And the major issue here, public education is inefficient. So here is where this far right meets neoliberal thinking. And this is very interesting because they start to use, for example, Brazil's position in the PICSA, the PISA, which is most of the educators are very well known because, well, we are in the lower ranks, or we are in the lower ranks of language skills and also mathematics, and that's why, because Paulo Freire is dominating the education system here in Brazil, and because advocacy for dialogue and critical thinking threats productive thinking. So the idea of thinking of education as a productive tool, which is also connected to the idea that education is linked to the formation of human capital. So this is very interesting here. So what are the far right's ideas for education? So the first thing, well, they need to create what they call a sacred alliance to exorcise Paulo Freire from our schools. So that's it. Well, they have, of course, an anti-pluralist view on gender, race, and inclusive education, which also brings sometimes also people from the powerful applies to this form of coalition, if not openly, at least giving some sort of support. Well, they also believe in a religious-oriented curricula in schools, so which is also there. And they start to bring this idea that we need military discipline to our children. So they start to advocate military schools, which is very interesting that it's something that is not only that is spreading all over Brazil now, and especially in the public system, so which is something that we need to pay attention. And there is also a trend of defending homeschooling as well. So defending homeschooling as part of this. But how do they operate in terms of the mechanisms that they use to enact their policies? So the major mechanism here that we have been something that we have explored in this article that we have published at the Better Journal. The Better Journal is the mechanism of othering, which means that creating an enemy, to create an enemy, and to create who's there. And who are the enemies? Who are really the enemies here? So for them, emancipated women. So emancipated women are their enemies. So this is so they do not believe, they believe in the role of women at home, doing domestic things, siding the men. So this is this very conservative thing. The other form of enemies is Black people and African religions as well. So the idea that these bringing the study of Black people and African religions threats Christian values. So we need to think of. Again, the other target is the LGBTQIA plus community as well. So which also endangers the Christian families, that very classic monogamic and heterosexual perspective on families. And above all, the educators. So educators, they had to have their discourse the restraint. They had to have they need to focus on a very instrumental and technical curricula. So this is something that is there. But so this is one mechanism. The other mechanism is to recreate and to reenact a mythical past, because of course, as most of them, they need to create some sort of military regime nostalgia. So, and this is something that is there. Well, they overthrow all the problems that we had under the military dictatorship, even in terms of their instrumental education, even in these terms, for example, but they have. So they think of bringing back regressive politics and to deploy institutional destruction. And in order to do this, they need to create a broad conservative populist alliance, which includes a new movement that started, was created in the century, that is the No Party School movement, so a movement that we have explored in our paper. An alliance with the Evangelical Parliamentary Front, which is very important for those who are not from Brazil. In the 70s, only 8% of our population were evangelicals, and nowadays we are talking about something like 35 to 39% of our population are declared evangelical. So they became not only a large part of the population here in Brazil, but also politically relevant as well. And some neoliberal movements as well. So we have neoliberal movements in terms of diminishing the size of state, also in terms of thinking in terms of how we are going to increase our human capital, and how we are going to create our schools as something that enables this form of creation. and also the creation of a neoconservative media. A neoconservative media that is not only settled in the so-called traditional outlets like newspapers, like TVs and radio, but also social media. So which has been very important to them. So this is the major issue in terms of how we are living this. And now I'm leaving to Katarina, and she's going to talk about the effects on policy,
Yes.
education policy.
Thank you, Mario. So I'm going to briefly discuss a few changes that were influenced by this coalition, and then we can discuss more during the debate. But what it's important to notice is that education is a key policy for this coalition, as it's a policy that it's a way to reinforce the discourse and ideas related to the nation. So we observed the Ministry of Education in the past saying that we are one nation, everybody is the same, we are all equal, we don't have any differences, and this on one hand reinforced the notion of nation, but on the other hand, it reinforces the idea that we are all Brazilians against the others that Mario talked about, that is the minority groups. So, so I think it's important to notice that education is key for them because of this possibility to reinforce a specific discourse. In the next slide, we elected a few changes that happened in the education policy. It's important to notice that changes started before Bolsonaro's government as a result of the straining of this coalition in the National Congress. So we had different politicians linked to religious groups and to conservative groups that pressure the federal government, Lula's government, but mostly Dilma's government and also Temer's government to veto specific policies or to change specific policies. So we have campaigns related to the HIV policy that were vetoed, but also in education we had a specific policy that was that seek to discuss gender and reproductive rights and LGBT at schools that was eliminated. This program was supposed to discuss these topics, and part of the program was eliminated, and another program was changed and became it was supposed to discuss reproductive rights, and then it changed to discuss dental care and nutrition. So it changed the focus of the policy change abruptly. We also have the moment of the approval of the common national curriculum base. The first proposals were discussing and giving centrality to diversity, to inclusion, to gender. So it was a very progressive proposal, but at the end of the process, especially during the public hearings that discuss the common national curriculum base, we face different conservative and religious groups going against these ideas and asking and pressuring for decreasing the focus, taking off a few words related, for example, gender. And then the National Council of Education kept a few of the content, but we know that it decreased a lot the focus on these topics. So this was these were important moments before Bolsonaro government that shows how this coalition was gaining space in the political arena and also the public debate. After that, we had the beginning of the Bolsonaro government during the 2019. So since 2019, we had the Bolsonaro government, and then we had major change. So then this coalition being in the government actually reinforced some of the changes, and also we saw other changes. As Mario said, we had a CKG, that is a department within the Ministry of Education that was responsible for policies related to the promotion of diversity, and also especially Quilombola, indigenous and Black communities, so students and schools within these communities. And we had the elimination of CKG, and also its policies. So we didn't, the policies were not transferred to another department. We just had the elimination of all policies that were responsible, that was responsibility of CKG. It's important to notice that we had two different fields. So we have been developing the research, which didn't stop in this paper. So we noticed that we have changes in two different fields, the sexual and reproductive rights and gender, and also ethnic and racial relations. And these fields involve changes in other policies. So we are here discussing education, but it's important to notice that we had changes in healthcare, we had changes in human rights. We have differences. For example, in HIV policy, we have a very well-known policy in HIV in Brazil, and we have a very institutionalized policy with a strong path. So we had less significant change in HIV, but in education we had more significant and major change as the elimination of departments and policies. In HIV, for example, we still have the policies, just we don't have campaigns for minority groups, for example. So we had a different focus, but the policy still exists, which didn't happen in the education policy. Besides that, I think it's important to say that at the national level, we have the major changes. And what is important for us in Brazil is that even though the education policy, as Mario said, is historically decentralized, so states and municipalities are the main responsible for the provision for schools, but at the same time, we had a national coordination that was important since the 1988 Constitution, but especially in the last 3 decades. This national coordination was very important to ensure access and similar standards across the country. And during Bolsonaro government, we had a decrease in this national coordination, and we had this change in the focus of the policy, eliminating all these policies that were focused on promoting diversity and tackling inequalities. So we had a shift in the policy at the national level, and also weaken in the national coordination. So these both movements influence subnational governments. So we see different influences at the subnational level. For example, we had the elimination of the word gender in most state and municipal education plans, and also our interviews show that for interviewees, it's not a good moment to discuss these topics in education policy at the subnational level as well. So not only the national level, but also the subnational level. So this coalition is not only influencing policies within the government, but also the discussion about these topics, and also the agenda of subnational governments. Even though this is the case, so subnational governments are restricted in dealing with these topics. We have two things that I think it's important to mention. One is that ideas related to the non-party school movement are being rejected. So it's a good finding. And also we have subnational governments protecting some policies. So in the case of HIV, as I said, we still have the policy at the subnational level, and non-governmental organizations participating in the service provision. But at the same time, in the case of education, as I said, we have these topics being discussed in a very restrictive way. So we don't have policies being adopted and implemented by subnational governments, as after all these changes, the feeling of subnational governments is that it's not a good moment, as I said, to discuss these topics and to implement policies about these topics. So we have this. Well, I'm going to stop here so we can discuss. So I was very briefly present the change, but we can discuss more each change depending on your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catarina and Mario and Andrea. It was a very, very enlightening presentation. And as a former school teacher who left Brazil at the time of all these policies, these new policies coming into place, I was part of a lot of, school-based debates around this school without party movement and this whole new perception of educators in Brazil. And I felt that as part of my identity as a teacher. And it is fascinating to see people like you and your research group doing the research about what led us to that moment, what is still around us, and what is being constructed in terms of policy, national policies and local policies around the idea of what educators should be, what educators should do, who educators are, and this whole discourse is about schools should not be about politics. Educators should not be getting involved in politics, should not be talking about that. So it's a little bit emotional for me as well as a Brazilian educator who was, targeted by some of those movements in my time in the classroom, that to see people like you really putting this analysis forward and broadcasting what is happening in your research papers, in your work. So thank you so much for bringing that knowledge to us about these national structures and these national movements. And we really appreciate that. I will curate some questions on the chat because we had plenty of questions and we have time. And of course, people are also more than welcome to keep posting more questions, or maybe if they prefer to raise their hands and say their questions out loud for us, that's also very, very fine. I would like to start with a question by Encarnacion, and then we have this list of questions. Encarnacion, I don't know, do you want to ask your question orally, or do you want me to go through some of them myself?
I may do it myself because I'd like to congratulate the speakers on an amazing presentation. I like the work by Paulo Freire and the fact that you are shown some bits and of himself, and especially on what's happening now in Brazil and perhaps in the all continents that we are witnessing little by little. It was very important. So thank you very much just for having thought about talking about this. And the presentation has made me think about lots of things concerning not just Paulo Freire and what's going on in Brazil, but some other issues which are previous to himself, or just to this far-right development in lots of places. So first question I'd like to pose was what type of education policy has been supported or endorsed by Lula da Silva? He's been very influential, and as we know, perhaps he was not for Freire's or supported his ideas so much, even though we know that he's a representative of left-wing populism. I was also interested in knowing whether these far-right now, well, we know Bolsonaro's ministers and himself, they support this idea of an effort-based or efficiency-based policy education policy, which now is being changed in other countries, like in Spain. I was thinking about that, the situation now on the new education law. Obviously, if we look at what's going on in Brazil, and before Bolsonaro, of course, Da Silva especially, I wonder whether the extent to which Freire's education policy or his views have been successful, especially as far as Brazilian schooling is concerned. And well, I was a little bit shocked by the institutional destruction you mentioned on one of the slides, so perhaps if you can elaborate on that. And finally, well, I'm very curious about people's reaction to all these changes. When you were explaining them, I was shocked by most of them, and I wonder what the reactions of the population, well, in particular in Brazil, but might have been. So I stop here. Thank you very much, and congratulations again.
Catarina, Catarina, Andrea, would you like to start first? We can go through following the order of Encarnacion's questions, because there are a lot of them. So I think it's better if we divide here. So Andrea and Catarina, would you like to start, and then I can talk a little bit about.
We can talk together. It was a little bit complex question.
I can start, and then Mario can complement me, because I think a few questions he discussed a bit. When Mario told about SECAG was created during Lula's government, so all these policies that seek to promote inclusion and diversity, especially for the minority groups, were adopted during Lula's government. Before Lula's government, we had Fernando Henrique's government, and Fernando Henrique's government was more focused in ensuring access. So most of the policy changes we had during the 90s, were policies to ensure universalization of elementary education, because there was the constitution determined that, and we didn't have major change before that. And then after, and also Fernando Henrique Cardoso's government adopt or train evaluation systems and information systems that are criticized by some of educators, but they were important to put light in the vulnerabilities and inequalities of educational outcomes, especially related to minorities. So then during Lula's government, we had all the adoption of all these different policies that, as Mario said, they are related to curriculum, they are related to teacher training, so teacher training specifically for indigenous schools, for example, the development of books and pedagogical materials specific for these schools. So we had different policies specific for these schools. Besides that, what I think I can answer, it's when we say there was an institutional destruction, is that we had institutional change. So change were not only changing bureaucrats or changing leaderships within the ministries, but also we had the elimination of SECAG, we had the elimination of policies.
And the councils, isn't it, Kata?
When we say institutional change, is because to kind of overcome that, we have to create new institutions in the next governments. It's not something that we have in place, and if we change governments, we can just bring other people or change ideas. It's just we have to rebuild some of these policies in the future. And also the reactions, it's hard to say, because we have people against these policies, but also we had the pandemic, and then schools were closed. So it's hard to say. I think in the next few years we are going to know better what are the people's reactions. Of course, we have groups that support these ideas, but they are not the majority today in Brazil. But it's hard to say because we have these 2 years that actually education policy, it was really damaged because we didn't have any national coordination, and we had very unequal responses in education during the pandemic. So it's hard to say what is going to happen. And I think Mario can say more about the far right supporting an effort-based, efficient-based policy. But we believe, as Mario told, we believe there is this coalition that kind of brings together conservative and liberal ideas, mainly thinking that families should choose what school they want. So if they want private or if they want public, and they not support a public system for all. This is what kind of brings them together. So I think Mario can develop more about that.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to start by saying, well, I'm just going to build a little bit about the reaction of people on this level. As Katarina said, well, we are almost 1 year, more than 1 year and 3/4 under a pandemic. So, which means that it also demobilized people to go to streets, for example. So this is one thing that is important, especially in this country where we were one of the spotlights of the pandemics here. So we had 600,000 deaths here, so it was very scared. So this is one thing that creates a form of demobilization. And the other thing, and I think it enters into what I would say, there is also another thing that demobilizes, and which is how this far right movement is penetrating in our lives, and especially in our everyday life. I once read a book by an Austrian that left Austria and went to the UK during the Nazi regime, and his book is called Defying Hitler. And one of the things that he says is that, well, the main problem of a dictatorship like that is that not only because it is a dictatorship, because not only it's a dictatorship that creates this kind of conditions, but also because it interferes in our everyday lives. Not only our everyday lives, but also our inner life, which means that I dream of Bolsonaro, I eat Bolsonaro, I live with Bolsonaro every day. So it creates also this idea that I am completely powerless against something that becomes that. And this is very interesting. And this is how, for example, and connecting to what you have said in terms of this international, I think it was Paula I can't remember who talked about also the connection with the other far right groups, for example. I think this is one of the issues that is there. So how do we feel ourselves powerless against, for example, these movements, because they enter in our imaginary as well. So this is something that is there, and so it creates this sensation that we cannot organize. And they are very instrumental in doing this due to these very discursive forms. And another thing that is interesting in Encarnacion's question about this connection with these efficiency-led policies or not, or effort-based, efficiency-based policies. We need to understand that, of course, as every ideology or every form of hegemony construction, it creates also a lot of contradictions in itself. So they settled this idea of meritocracy. So we need to be meritocrat in these very neoliberal standards. But at the same time, they also, they do not know how to do it. Because of course they were not formed in terms of into the education policies. They were completely apart. They were completely outcast, even in terms of a more conservative or a more neoliberal perspective on this. So they are the outcasts of the neoliberal ideas as well. So this is very problematic. So from the beginning, for example, when Bolsonaro government went to power, they hired people from engineering, production engineering, to the Ministry of Education in order to create some policies there. No, nothing against engineers, because well, engineers are also, I don't have any problem with that, but people with no background in terms of education. So in this order, that's why it's interesting to treat them in a very medical way, in terms of, oh, there is the myth of meritocracy, so there is also medical ways of implementing. But the major project is to say to everybody, the school does not belong to anyone. So there are only a few people that need to go to school. So for example, our new Ministry of Education, who came from a Presbyterian university here in Brazil, and he's a religious guy, Milton Ribeiro. He has said several times, well, university is not for all, so it's not something that is there. So they do not believe in education as a right. They understand education as an instrument. So this is a form of creating this. So I think this is a little bit less how I understand this situation.
Yeah, and only in this point that Mario says about the Bolsonaro is in the day of the people, and answering the question of Encarnación sobre about the population, the mobilizations of the population. I don't know if Catarina and Mario agree, but we stay a little bit surprised with the Bolsonaro campaign, with the conservative population. Brazilian is more conservative than we thought. And they use in Bolsonaro's discourse and this far-right discourses, they use some flags very important in other countries in Latin America too, like the gender ideology. It was an important platform to Colombia's election, presidential election too, in many countries. The No Party School, the movement, they talk about something that much probably many parents never thought before. I don't know if my kid's teacher talk about criticism, talk about communism. I don't know. So the parents, they incentivated, they started to these parents, that most part are evangelicals, are religions, to started to take attention, pay attention in the school, the kids' school. So when they say, no, how the teachers, how the school teaches gender, teachers sexuality education, the family needs to teach this. It's not the role of the school, it's the role of the family. So they distort it, they change the narratives and can and receive more space to this debate, to this discourse, there is many actors involved in these discourses. The churches, the evangelical churches, the neoliberal, the private schools. So there is many interests in the middle of the far-right discourses.
Thank you very much, Andrea, Mario, and Catarina for this very thorough reply to these questions. And if you don't mind, I'll mix one question that I had myself with some other questions we have here on the chat. So put some things together. So thinking about something that you mentioned in your paper, and you touched upon that briefly today as well, about the idea of othering and how those far right populist movements, and here this is my link to more international movements as well. And then the questions we had, the question we had from Paula about the possible connections between what's happening in Latin America and Brazil, those movements in that area of the world, with others like Hungary and Turkey, and even if I may say, some movements here in the UK as well, trying to constrain what teachers can do, what can be said, what cannot be said as part of diversity and inclusion. So you mentioned this idea of othering as being a mechanism for this new contemporary populist movements in the far right. And it made me think about the beginning of your presentation as well in relation to what Paulo Freire was putting forward in terms of diversity and his views on inclusions. Do you think there is a direct link between this new way of organizing the populist movements around the idea of othering as a reaction against those proposals about inclusion and the broadening understanding of inclusion to in terms of gender, in terms of race and ethnicity? Do you think there is a direct link between those ideas that Paulo Freire was putting forward, and not just Paulo Freire, a lot of progressive thinkers at that time about inclusion through education, and the rise of this othering mechanism that those movements are adopting today? It makes me think if this is a direct reaction to that. I got kind of almost like a physics teacher in my head, like the reaction and action of things.
Mm-hmm. Catarina and Andrea, would you like to? Okay.
Start and then we complement.
Okay, I think it's a very interesting insight, Haira, because it's okay. One thing that we, when we study social movements, of course, social movements, they create opposition. So it's interesting in terms of, well, I am opposed to the patriarchate. I am opposed to the white, to the idea of the white cis heterosexual man. So social movements do this. Even what we call progressive social movements, they also create some sort of opposition. So this is part of the political life. The problem is, and I'm using a lot of Chantal Mouffe's idea here for those who I think most of you, especially in the UK, are very well aware of Laclau's and Chantal Mouffe's work. I think the main issue here is how the othering mechanism is not a question of what we would call a dialectical superation of differences. So it's not something that would go to the inclusion, which is in the root of Freire's work in terms of, well, I am accepting the other, well, I am against his ideas, I am accepting the other, but we are now going to construct something together. So this is something that is different. The othering mechanism is the annulation of the other. It's the elimination of the other. So there is no othering, there is no dialogue. So there is no dialogue, so there is nothing to construct with. So this is there. And I think that it's very interesting what you have said, because, and I think it's a very interesting insight, because it has a short circuit from Paulo Freire's idea and the idea of othering as a mechanism of doing this. So that's why, for example, this very destructive mechanism that is destructive way of doing othering is there. We need to think that, for example, and it's not new in the far right. So if we go back to the 20th century and the beginning of the fascist movement, and that was there. So one of the parts of the fascist movement was futurism, and futurism was also, well, we need to annihilate the past. We need to overthrow this to construct a new order. So this, the idea of a new order, but a new order that is combined with something that comes from a nostalgia of the past. And here is a very Heideggerian sense of what is past. And that's why Heidegger was completely for Nazis. So this is very interesting here. So I think I think it's a very interesting idea. So how this mechanism, it is part of how it's antithetical to Paulo Freire's idea. So I think it's very interesting.
Thank you very much, Mario. And I think that will bring me nicely to another question that I'm merging from the chat. So I'm bringing Elisa's question and Mariano's question together in terms of the resistance. Now, thinking about the resistance that we have, that there might be against this process of this mechanism of othering that is about erasing and about annihilation of the other, right? So both Elisa and Mariano, they were interested in that area. So I'm gonna read both questions, but I think they go well together. And could you please refer a bit more to whether Freire's work has also played a role in the opposition resistance to these changes, especially I think when we look at the local levels and what is happening at the local level in relation to the policies. And then Mariano's question was a lot about that, this articulation of resistance to those national policies or the erasing of those national policies and structures like CKD. So it's thinking especially from the perspective of students and the teacher organizations, and how do you see the resistance happening from educators, from students in that local level? If you think Paulo Freire's ideas can be supportive to organizing that resistance, and also how do you see the future of what's happening in this area, considering polarization that we see, not just in relation to that specific side of the far-right movement, but also in relation to, for instance, environmental crisis. So all this polarization that we see internationally, how do you look at the future in this sense?
Well, I will start, but I think Mario can talk a little about that. We see that Paulo Freire's idea have been used by groups that are against all these policies as a mechanism of building also a discourse of what is the Brazilian education and trying to bring back ideas that were not at the center of the debate for a while. So I think this we can see that we can see Paulo Freire's ideas inspiring a few movements, and especially people within the university that are against and have some space to debate. Also, we didn't have a systematically research. I think it's a good research question. What are the how can I say the resistance strategies of resistance. But doing our interviews, we also know that we have different bureaucrats that decided that stay because they are public servants, but also people that are nominated and decided to stay within the federal government to kind of try to keep what is left. So we interview some of these people in different policy areas, not only education. So people that are trying to keep something in the national policy. Also, we have the National Council of Education. We had a change in some of the representatives that have seats there that are more aligned to Bolsonaro's government, but we still have a few people that try to go against. And in education, we have some councils that represent municipalities and states. So we also noticed during the pandemic, especially, they have been mobilized against some of the policies and some of these changes. So I think this is something that it would be interesting to better grasp. But I think it's what I can say. We didn't do a very systematic research on that, but I think it's super interesting. But I'm just bringing some of the things we we collect during interviews and document analysis.
Andrea, would you like to add something?
I think is it.
Okay.
I will don't complete another thing that your before answer about the ordering. Only it's important, is interesting to observe as the idea of ordering, the idea of eliminated the enemy, the eliminate the different ideas. It's it's central in the Bolsonaro's government, in the Bolsonaro's educational policy, because another day we are talking about this. Bolsonaro and his ministers, they are more worried in eliminated what was controlled, destroyed what Lula, Dilma, and the other progressive governments did, than constructed something different. So I think it's war. It's terrible. It's very dangerous in any country, especially in a country so unequal like Brazil, that the public education is so central on the debate, on the progress, on the inequalities. However.
And can I just add something? I think something that is very important for Brazilians and for this right-wing conservative coalition about related to Paulo Freire's idea is the critical thinking. I think this is central, and how we can, through schools, develop a more political and critical thinking. And I think that's why Paulo Freire became such an enemy, not only because of the other things we already discussed, but I think it's important to highlight that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I may, I'm just going to jump a little bit on this, because in terms of bringing Paulo Freire to the issue of resistance, well, we know from past researchers, from other researchers from the past, that Paulo Freire's ideas were essential and central to the organization of the opposition movements here during the military dictatorship. So it was there, but at that time there was also the support of the liberation theology, so which means the parts of the Catholic Church. Of course, there is an disempowering part of the liberation theology within the Catholic Church, so they are not as empowered as well. But there is an issue that is for me, that is becoming very interesting. I think that in the last years, because Paulo Freire has become much demonized by the far right, it created also backlash. And people are starting to learn about Paulo Freire, even people who are not aware of Paulo Freire's work. And he is becoming part of also as a symbol of resistance in itself. So I'm just going to share you a picture of, this is a mural that was painted in front of the Memorial of Latin America, which is a landmark here in São Paulo city. And it's a huge mural with Paulo Freire's effigy here. So, and with this, esperançar, amar é ato de coragem. So hope, love is a bravery act. So for those who are. So why it's important to think about it? Because we also need to understand that these form of mechanisms, as I was telling you, they work in the imaginary. And one of the things that we need to is how these discourse, we need symbols. So it's not only the question of Paulo Freire ideas organizing people, but also the figure and the status of Paulo Freire as becoming even an icon for resistance. So this is also important. It's not, which is very, and it's very contradictory for anyone who works with emancipation ideas and everything else, because it's a form of cult of personality, which is completely against of Paulo Freire's ideas. But it's also interesting to understand how it is happening as well. So I think Paulo Freire ideas are becoming more popularized now, I think because of this backlash. And I think also that his figure is becoming something that is part of the resistance. And I think the centenary, Paulo Freire centenary is also a key issue in this process.
Yes, and open the debate for other areas. Until now, the debate was very concentrated in the educational area. Of course, the educational university courses always teach Paulo Freire, always talk about the debates Paulo Freire. But now with the centenary, with this attack of the conservative movement, other areas started to be interested. Oh no, look, it's really a reference to Brazilian education, to Brazilian history.
Thank you very much, Andrea, Mario, Catarina. It's such a very interesting and helpful insight into this whole contradiction of what you said, Mario, about the cult of the personality that comes with Paulo Freire, and as a symbol of resistance. And on the other hand, on the other side, or maybe together, this idea of how his ideas can help us support the resistance on the ground, in a sense, right? We have seen, especially during the pandemic, a lot of policy changes and a lot of movements in relation, for instance, to education, like trying to make changes without public consultation, and using the pandemic landscape as a way of passing different policies that are neoconservative in nature. We've seen that here with teacher education programs in England, and this kind of almost an instrument, an approach that tries to bypass public consultation and public voice and emancipation. That was the core of what Paulo Freire was talking about in his idea on democracy. So it's a very interesting thing to think about what the pandemic is actually doing for us in terms of resistance and enabling us to organize resistance or not. So I think when we had a question by Mariana about the future, I think that's something that we need to think in relation to the legacies of the pandemic and the legacies of this process of diminished public involvement and public participation that might stay as a result of the pandemic, in how we can bring that idea of emancipation and political participation and democracy that was at the core of Paulo Freire's work back to the scenario, to the arena. I'm conscious of time, so I just want to use the final minutes to open the floor to Susan. Susan, if you want to say some final words before we close this amazing session, and thanks everyone for your questions and for your contributions here on the chat as well.
Just to say what a wonderful occasion this has been, and a fantastic exploration. I missed about half an hour, but I'd already read your paper, Mario and colleagues, Catarina, Andrea. I was kind of in the chat, kind of thinking about the two things. Just one is the kind of politics of erasure. And I was thinking about the Klauer-Muth's work around discourse and their notions of equivalences and differences. But there's a third element here that I think you've been describing, which is actually about, it's kind of the negation, actually. It's the refusal to recognize, to give any space, to enable a category to kind of exist, which seems to me really quite interesting. And then just finally, that reflection that you all had on, what would Freire kind of think about, being kind of put up as the kind of symbol. And my thought was, the progressive left needs anything it can get its hands on at the moment. And I suspect, given that, Freire would actually be up for that in that sense, because actually it's about a struggle over a just life and a tolerant life. And if the kind of symbolism of for him actually could be made to work in that kind of way, my sense is it's that kind of politics that he would actually recognise and think was really important. So actually, I just want to say, as first to the organisers, that Rocio and Alex and to Hira. Hira, thank you so much for chairing. Thank you to our three presenters. You've been incredibly generous with your time and your works. And if anyone hasn't read the papers, then do go off and do that. They're incredibly insightful, and they add something incredibly important, very, very important, to the wider debates around the rise of authoritarian populism, kind of more broadly connected to other developments, Turkey, Hungary, the UK, United States, and so on. Because my sense is in the United States is we haven't seen the end potentially of Trump, and certainly some of the Trump followers out there are not giving up that easily. So this is an incredibly important space and set of debates. So thank you so much. I don't know if, Mariano, you want to come in and talk about next week in the Ideas Lab?
Yes, yeah, hi. Well, thanks to all the presenters and hi, Alex and Rocio. It was a really incredible session. We are really honored to have you here presenting in this small and humble space that we have every week. Next week, we have Lee Lawrence, which is a former PhD student or still PhD student, presenting some of her recent submitted thesis on China moral education.
But it's also, Mariano, to say that if any of our colleagues on the call today, the Zoom call today, you know, it's in the kind of spirit actually of Freire is that this is an open space. We just try and manage who gets access to the codes, but nevertheless, colleagues have come in from all over the world, and anyone here is very welcome to join any of the weeks of the Ideas Lab. So just reach out to us. And that's kind of, I think, in the spirit of a kind of global public debate about things that matter. And matter hugely to the next generation and actually to all of you here. So thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Mario.
You
thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Catarina.
Thank you very much.
It was amazing.
Thank you
so
very
much.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.